We want the future to come together. But the question is, when what God has in store for us is different from what we would choose, then what? We have things that we've prayed for to happen, and if they don't, then what? We have things that we've prayed to not happen. And if they do, then what? I want us to look at 3 or 4 people in the Bible who went through this very thing and show us how faith is able to react to God even when things don't go our way. We're going to start in the book of Job. I hope you're turning there. The book of Job as I try to pull myself together. The title of this lesson is But If Not. But if not. Our first point this morning is, but if not, I will still worship him. Starting in the book of Job, we're going to start in chapter 1. And notice just beginning in verse number 1. And we know the story of Job, but I want us to be refreshed by it and remember what happens here and see Job's response when things don't go his way. Starting in verse number 1, there was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that the man was the greatest of all the people of the east. He was rich, he was blessed by God, and he knew he was blessed by God. He was blameless, upright, feared God, turned away from evil. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them. And he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. We see how righteous he is. He doesn't even know his children have sinned. But they say, well, maybe they did. So let me offer a sacrifice anyway. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." So Satan says, well, Job's a good guy because, God, you've given him everything he's ever wanted. He's got his children, he's got his land, he's got his servants, he's got his livestock. I mean, if anybody had that guy's life, he would serve you the same way. But if you take that stuff away, notice what Satan says. He accuses Job. He tells God what's going to happen. Now keep in mind, God's omniscient. God knows everything. He doesn't need Satan to tell him what's going to happen. But Satan takes it upon himself to inform God. If you take away what this man has, he will curse you to your face. Think about the faith that Satan has in Job. Satan believes that Job is just like any other materialistic person whose faith in God is dependent upon the things that they have. And he's so confident that Job is not the outstanding man that he seems to be, and that there's one fell swoop away, Job is, from turning his back on everything and cursing God. Now Satan here doesn't have a very high view of Job, and he thinks of us the same way. In fact, the Bible tells us in the book of Revelation that he stands to accuse us day and night. he really thinks and says the same thing about all of us. Now, we don't know if this kind of conversation between Satan and God still occurs to this day to the same way, but this is Satan's general situation. He says, if you take away his things, he will curse you. The Lord said to Satan, verse 12, behold, all that he has is in your hand. He gives him permission to do what he's asked, only against him, that is his health. Do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you. While I was yet speaking, there came another and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. He's thinking, man, I've lost some livestock. I've lost some goods. While he was yet speaking, verse 17, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. He's lost his possessions. He's lost his servants, his employees. He's down to pretty much just himself and his family. And maybe at this point he's thinking, at least my children are okay. But while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Think about how horrible of a day this is. And think about how the news is presented. It would be so easy to blame God. You know, the Sabaeans came out and killed some oxen and donkeys. We might say, well, that's on them. But verse 16, his servant tells him, the fire of God fell from heaven on your sheep. He might be thinking, what did I do to deserve that? Verse 17, the Chaldeans came and formed a raid and killed his donkeys and camels. Well, that's on them. Maybe, they just felt like doing that. But then verse 18, notice how his children die. A great wind came across the wilderness. And maybe Job's thinking, wait a second, doesn't God control the wind? Isn't God in charge? Isn't God sovereign? Isn't God the one on whom all of this depends? And you could see how Job could blame God, how he could be angry with God. You could see why Satan would say he's going to curse you to your face. But in verse 20, Job stands up. And he tore his robe, and he shaved his head, and he fell on the ground, and he worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And the Bible tells us in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. And we're given a great insight here to Job. And really the best thing you could say about Job in this case is that Satan was wrong. And he often is. He's a liar. And Satan thinks, surely you just take Job's stuff away, and he curses God to his face. And Job, there with nothing, bows before God and worships. And Satan learned something about Job that day, and it was that Job didn't serve God because of what God gave him. Job served God because of who God is. Job didn't worship God because he was so blessed. Job worshiped God because God was worthy of his worship. And Job knew that God was as worthy as his worship on his worst day than as he was on his best day. And that's what Satan didn't see coming. You could keep reading, and in chapter 2, the one thing that God said Satan couldn't do, touch his health, Satan's allowed to do. And Job is in absolutely pitiful position. We can read in verse 7 that Satan struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Can you imagine just being covered in sores from your scalp all the way down to your toes? And it says in verse 8 that he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. Absolutely miserable. And then to add all that, add injury to insult, or insult to injury rather, his wife comes and says to him, verse 9, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." Everything stacked up against him. Verse number 10, but he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women. Shall we receive good from God? And shall we not receive evil?" And all this Job did not sin with his lips. He tells his wife, essentially, she doesn't know what she's talking about. And I think if we could paraphrase it in the modern day language, Job is saying, you don't know God the way I do. Because Job knew, somehow, by his faith, that God was still worthy of Job's worship, that God did not deserve to be cursed, that God somehow or another was going to make this right and make it all worth it. And if you read to the end of the book, that's exactly what happens. Job chapter 42, verse number 10. Job, after he's left to wonder and to struggle and to pray and to be tormented, and when he speaks to God, God doesn't answer any of his questions. You know, sometimes we say the book of Job tells us why good people suffer. It doesn't really. The book of Job, the point of the book of Job is that in our suffering, God is still God. That when times are hard, God is still God. He's still worthy of our worship. He's as good as he was when he blessed us with all those wonderful things. He's as good on that day. He's the same good God when all those things go away. So Job asks all these questions. Mostly he asks God, "Where are you?" And when God comes at the end of the book of Job, he answers the question with a question. And he asks Job, "Where were you?" And he goes through all of creation. Where were you when I did this, when I did this, when I did this? And the point that God is trying to get Job to realize is that Job's circumstances and experiences don't change who God is. And I think if we could figure that out, maybe just my own self, if I could grasp that, I know my faith would be stronger. That God's character, God's worthiness, who God is, doesn't change based on what I go through. He's still the same good God. So Job said, I have a way I want my life to go. I want my children to stay. I want my stuff to stay. I want to have everything and keep everything. I want everything to go my way. We wouldn't want any different. But Job was able to say, but if not, if I do lose it all, I'm still going to worship God because God's still worthy. At the next place, I want us to look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel chapter 3. And in Daniel chapter 3, we find these three Hebrew boys. And we're going to see that this point, but if not, I will still obey him. There's a way we think things might go, should go, hope to go. But even if they don't, are we going to obey God and do what he says? In Daniel chapter 3, we read about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I feel bad for them. That's not their given names that their mothers gave them. Those are the names that their Babylonian kidnappers gave them. And as they're spending exile in Babylon, away from all their friends, away from all their family, away from their home, away from their temple, away from everything they know, to pile onto that, now they're forced, or at least it seems they're forced, to bow down to a false image, to a false god. Pick up with me in Daniel chapter 3, beginning in verse number 1. And let's read about King Nebuchadnezzar. He made an image of gold, verse number 1, whose height was 60 cubits, and its breadth was 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent together the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. This is a who's who. This is like a presidential inauguration. You ever watch a presidential inauguration and they show the camera, they pan it through the crowd, and every politician who's ever lived seems to be there? Same thing here. Look, I've set up this image. We're going to worship it. This is our God now. I want everybody to come out and celebrate this. And tells us there in verse number 4, he and the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded," not suggested, not requested, "you are commanded, O peoples, nations, languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace." The principle is simple. Either bow down and worship this image or die. But it's more than that. Bow down, worship this image, or die an excruciating death of being burned alive. But it's even more than that. Forsake all other gods and come to this image that I just set up and worship it, or suffer the punishment. Verse 7, "Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up." You know, the Jews weren't the only people in captivity in Babylon. The Babylonian Empire had expanded, and as it expanded, it took people from all over the place. And they're saying, hey, whoever your God used to be, whoever you used to worship, this is your God now. Bow down or face the consequences. Verse 8, "Therefore at that time certain Chaldeans," that is Babylonians, "came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, 'O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up.'" Notice what he says. You spared these men's lives, you put them in positions of authority, and now they don't even care about you. They don't even listen to you. You set up this image, you gave a law, everybody needs to bow down to worship it, and they refused to. Verse 13, "Nebuchadnezzar was in furious rage, and he commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, 'Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve any gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace, and who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?'" He says, nobody can save you, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You either bow down and worship this image, or you get thrown into the furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter." And he tells them there in verse 17, "If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king." Their faith is on display. We don't have to give you an answer. If you want us to throw us in the fire, throw us in the fire. But notice what they say. Our God is able to deliver us. But notice verse 18. Notice this statement of faith. But if not. What are they saying? We believe God will deliver us. But even if God does not come through the way we want him to, even if God's will is different from ours, even if God has a different plan, even if God's will for his purposes and his wisdom is for us to be burnt alive, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say, but if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. They say there's a way we want it to be. There's a way we think it'll happen. We think God will deliver us. We have faith in that. But here's the thing. Even if he doesn't, it doesn't change the fact that we're going to obey him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had this outlook. Our obedience to God is not dependent on what he does for us. Our obedience to God is dependent on this simple fact, that he deserves it, that he has spoken, and now we must act. You can throw us in the fire. You can tear us to pieces. You can give us to the lions. Whatever you want to do, it doesn't change this fact that God has said, have no other gods. And for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it really was as simple as that, whatever the consequences are. We have a way we want it to be. We want to be rescued. We believe God will deliver us, but even if he doesn't, it doesn't change what we're going to do. Some people might look at these Hebrew boys and say that they're irrational, that they're crazy. Why not just bow down and then you can be saved and not have to go into the fire? But these men knew who God was. They knew who God was capable of. They knew what God had said. And sometimes our faith will look irrational to people who don't know God. Our job isn't to look like, perfect people to people in the world who don't even believe in God or maybe even curse God. Their opinion of us shouldn't matter at all. It really doesn't matter because we're here to serve God and we're here to please him. And it will often be the case in our life that we can't please God and man. We're going to have to choose one or the other. And we have to choose one or the other. The obvious and best choice is to please God and to obey him. And now we don't have a government, thankfully, setting something up and saying, hey, come worship this or get thrown into a furnace. But these tactics are still around today. We're surrounded by false gods, things that Satan wants us to worship, whether it's materialism and goods and riches, whether it's sex, whether it's a big one right now is my own personal identity and my own, how I like to define myself. And we prop that up as the highest good. As long as I get to be free and live my life the way I want to live my life. But wait a second. All that is a God in addition to the true God of heaven and earth. And Satan says, bow down or else. Or bow down and you get everything you want. Right? That's what Satan told Jesus. Just worship me and all the kingdoms of the earth will be yours. So we might be far removed from Babylonian captivity, but here in this world, where Satan still prowls, there's a lot of false gods being set up. And the question is, are we willing to face the consequences of not worshiping them? We believe God will deliver us. I believe God will bless us for keeping God as the true God in our hearts and our lives. But what if things get worse? What if things get harder? What if there are consequences for not bowing down? Are we willing to go through them knowing that God will make it worth it? I believe Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego believed that this life was not all there is. So if you throw me in the fiery furnace, all that is a ticket to the place I've been trying to go anyway. And I get to see my God face to face. I want to keep reading in verse number 19. Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated, so now it is very hot. And he ordered some of his mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace was overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. It was so hot, the people who carried them there died. This thing is so hot, it's burning hot. Verse 24, then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. He answered and said, but I see 4 men, unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Think about that for a second. The threat of the fiery furnace meant nothing to these men because of the faith they had in God. And then the actuality of the threat meant nothing to these men because God delivered them. But even if God in his will had another purpose and said Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are going to die today in that furnace, they still would have been thrown in that furnace. But if not, they said, it's not going to change that we're going to obey God. I don't know about you. When I read this, all I can do is ask God to have that kind of faith, to be able to stand my ground, and to be able to say, regardless of the consequences, regardless of what God may or may not have in store, regardless of whatever pain we might experience, to say that I will obey God no matter what. No matter who intimidates me, no matter who tries to pull me off, no matter who tries to distract me, no matter who tries to get me over here to worship something else, I'm going to obey God, knowing that he's going to make it worth it in the end. We trust that God will deliver us, but like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we have to believe that even if he doesn't, he's still worthy of our obedience, because we know that this life is not all there is, that God will make it worth it. Just like he blessed Job with double, he blessed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he'll bless us as well when we're not too afraid to obey him. Lastly, but if not, I will still serve him. But if not, I will still serve him. Turn with me to Matthew 26, if you would. Matthew 26, and we see Jesus in the garden. And when we see Jesus in the garden, we see a man who's under more pressure, I think, than any of us ever have been or ever will be. Not to undermine the things you've gone through, but to simply emphasize what Jesus was experiencing. To know that you're about to die and how you're going to die and how excruciating it's going to be and how much anguish you're going to be in. The Bible says that he was sorrowful to the point of death. I don't know if any of us will feel the magnitude of this pressure that Jesus felt in Gethsemane. He knows he's about to be betrayed. He knows he's about to bear the sins of the world and suffer and die an agonizing death. And he prays. Notice what he prays. Matthew 26, beginning in verse number 36. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." He wants them to stay up and watch and pray with him. And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words again. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." Jesus, it's told us, prays 3 times the same prayer. And the prayer is, "If it is possible, let this cup pass from me, nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will." He's praying essentially, is there any way that this can happen without me going through the suffering I'm about to go through? Is there any other possibility? Is there anything we could change? Is there any way, God, that it could be your will? Maybe your will could change, that your only son doesn't have to die on the cross. When we read this, we need to pay attention not just to what Jesus says, but to what Jesus does not say. Jesus does not demand that things should be different. He does not demand that if his will does not come to fruition, he will not serve the Father. Jesus doesn't say, "God, either change your will or I'm not doing it." Jesus says, if there's any way, please let it not happen, but if it does, your will be done. Jesus isn't giving the Father terms and conditions to his service. He's praying, earnestly begging for things to be different, but he says, even if they're not, I'm still going to serve you and do what you would have me to do. He's not holding the Father hostage and saying, make it happen my way or it won't happen at all. Out of faith and reverence and love, he communicates his will to the Father, but acknowledges that he will ultimately do the Father's will. If I'm honest with myself, I don't always have the same outlook. I have a set of conditions in my mind, and I say, God, if you will create the set of conditions that I'm thinking of in my mind, then I will serve you. God, if you do this for me and let it be this way and let my will be your will, then I can do what you would ask me to do. And I have this idea that I can really only serve God to my greatest ability when my will is being brought out into the world, when things are the way I would want them to be, when they're most convenient for me, when they're easiest for me, when the conditions are perfect according to my standards, then I can serve God. But Jesus doesn't say that. Jesus says, let your will be done. Part of why Jesus can say this is because Jesus trusts that the Father's will is best. But sometimes we need to be reminded that there's a way we would want it to be. There's a way we would have it to be. There's a way we would pray for it to be. But there is one who knows all the details, who has all the facts, who can see the future, who knows what will happen in this case and that case. And we have to submit to his will and say, Father, it's your will. Sure, I want it to be this way, but at the end of the day, Father, let your will be done. We might have a way we would like things to be, but if not, like Jesus, we can still follow God. We need to remember that his thoughts are not our thoughts, his ways are not our ways. Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. As much higher as the heavens are than the earth, his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. As much higher as the heavens is than the earth, his ways are higher than our ways. You know, sometimes we try to present to God terms and conditions for our service to him. God, if you jump through my hoops, if you accomplish my will, then I can serve you. But it might be the very things that we don't want to happen. When they happen to us, those might be the very things that qualify us for service to God. Those things we prayed wouldn't happen and did. Those things we prayed would happen and didn't. Those difficulties, those hardships, those weaknesses, those infirmities, the anxiety, the depression, the stress, the difficulty, that might be the very spot that I need to be so that God can show his strength in me. And that when I do serve him, despite my weaknesses, despite my struggles, despite my hardships, when people watch it, when people see it, they cannot give me any of the glory. Because it's not by my strength, it's by his strength. And that's exactly what we see if you'll turn with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. There's a great parallel between Jesus in the garden and Paul praying about his thorn in the flesh. They both pray 3 times. The same prayer. Jesus that the cup will pass, Paul that the thorn will be removed. They receive essentially the same answer. And they both serve God anyway. In 2 Corinthians 12, Paul is defending his apostleship to the Corinthians because they had become persuaded that he wasn't the apostle that they used to think that he was. Because of false teachers, false apostles, they began to doubt Paul. So Paul has to spend a majority of 2 Corinthians defending his own ministry to people at a church that he planted because they've been deceived. But in 2 Corinthians 12, Paul tells them of a vision that he had. In verse 3, he begins and says that this man was caught up into paradise, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which a man may not utter. On behalf of this man I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast, except of my weaknesses. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. Paul says, I've got a lot of reasons to boast. But notice what God does, verse 7. So to keep me from becoming conceited, that is arrogant, puffed up, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh. What is it? We don't know. We know it wasn't comfortable. A thorn in the flesh never is. But he says, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. What's the implication? If that thorn wasn't there, Paul would have got puffed up. He would have got arrogant. It's hard to be a slave of Jesus Christ when you're so full of yourself. So God allowed this thorn to persist. 3 times, Paul says, I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. What's his prayer specifically? God, take this thorn away. I don't want it. It's uncomfortable. It's miserable. Take it from me. But he said to me, verse 9, my grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness. Paul says, therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I'm content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. You know, I don't know about you, but it's never my will to be weak. I don't want to be weak. I don't want to be described as weak. I want to be strong. I want to have it all together. It's not my will to be insulted. I don't want to be insulted. Nobody likes to be insulted. It's not my will to experience hardship. I want my life to be easy and fun and enjoyable and good. It's not my will to experience persecution. I want to believe what I believe and not be bothered for it, and not be attacked for it, and not criminalized for it. It's not my will to experience calamity. I don't want to go through an accident. I don't want to have it all crumble. I want everything to be okay. It's not my will to experience those things. It wasn't Paul's will to have a thorn in the flesh. But the question is, what if it's these very experiences that give Christ the opportunity to shine in us? What if it's the very things I don't want to go through that God knows in his omniscience and in his wisdom and in his goodness are the very things that will transform me into a person who now finally does no longer rely on himself, but relies fully and totally on God. That's why in this same book of 2 Corinthians, it starts with Paul saying, the comfort we receive from God when we're in our afflictions, we can use that to comfort you. And he tells them in verses 8 through 10 that they had some trouble in Asia to the point where they despaired even life itself. And he tells the Christians in verse 9, so that we would depend on God who raises the dead. I don't want to be weak. I don't want to experience hardship. I don't want to experience calamity. But what if I changed the way I thought about those things, and instead of seeing them as the horrible things they are, the difficult things they are, the things I don't want to happen, what if I saw them as an opportunity to serve him, not by my own strength, but by the strength that he supplies? What if I saw it as an opportunity for people to look at me and see Christ? What if I saw it as an opportunity to grow an even deeper relationship with God? What if I saw it as an opportunity to even be more like Jesus, who suffered and struggled and whose own will wasn't always accomplished on earth? Even if it's God's will for me to suffer or to experience hardship or to suffer calamity, I can still serve him. In fact, I might even be able to serve him better in the midst of those things, because I'm not serving him by my strength. I'm serving him by the strength that only he can give me. Sometimes we lose. Sometimes we suffer. Sometimes we're tested. And it's in these moments that we find out who we are and we find out what our faith is made of. And there's times where we are driven to our knees, where we are weak, when we do want to quit. But maybe the Bible can teach us to reframe the way we think. Like Job, I could think that loss is an opportunity to worship God for giving in the first place. Like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, danger and risk are an opportunity to obey God anyway. Like Paul, weakness is an opportunity to display Christ's strength. It is true, and we can't forget that God is good all the time. His will is always better than our will. His ways are always higher. We can't always understand it, but we can always trust. And we can always hope that God has good things in store for us. But if not, we can build a faith that worships anyway, that obeys anyway, that serves anyway, knowing that one way or the other, in this life or the next, God will make it all worth it. Maybe you need to come to that God this morning. There's no promise that it'll be easy. There's no promise that you won't be weak, that you won't suffer, that you won't be at your wit's end. But there is a promise that God will not change, that he will never leave you, that he will never forsake you, and that he will reward you for your faith in him. That same God is extending an invitation this afternoon to put your faith and your trust in him. And maybe you haven't been taking God as seriously as you need to. Today's the day to change, to remember who he is, and to give him what he deserves. Maybe you want to take hold of the greatest blessing he has to offer, that no matter what happens to you in this life, that if you're washed in the blood of his Son, and if you walk in his light, one day you will hear him say, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." If you want to take hold of that this afternoon, now's the time to do it. May we all worship, obey, and serve the God who deserves it. Thank you.
Restore my spirit, Lord, I need restored. My heart is weary, please help me, dear Lord. I stand in need of more strength from your word. Renew my love, rebuild my faith, oh, restore my soul. Revive the fire, Lord, deepen my soul. Stir my desire to work in your fold. Light in my heart, dear God, your zeal grown cold. Renew my love, rebuild my faith, oh, restore my soul. Renew my courage, Lord, it needs restored. My cup is empty, refill it, dear Lord. Replace all doubts and fear with faith so bold. Renew my love, rebuild my faith, oh, restore my soul. Amen. Thank you, Forrest. Great lessons. God bless you. Closing song, 610. Take my hand, precious Lord. We'll sing the first verse and have our closing prayer. When my way groweth drear, precious Lord, linger near. When my life is almost gone, hear my cry, hear my call, hold my hand lest I fall. Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home.
Got one last announcement. This week being Thanksgiving, the pantry will be held on Wednesday and not on Thursday. And if anyone would like to join and help that morning, it'd be appreciated.